Some details that jumped out at me were two new pieces of legislation.
I did not have expectations of this throne speech, Mr. Speaker, because since the day I was born, Inuit have heard promises of a good life.
The commitments made towards Indigenous peoples in the chapter from the throne are those that continue.
Tonight, reaction to Canada's speech from the throne.
They actually have no understanding of the profound and deeply multi-generational conflict that exists here, and that it's really about the land.
And a look back at media coverage of the 1990 siege of Kanesatake. Good evening, I'm Dennis Ward. Welcome to APTN National News. After being prorogued since August, Canada's 43rd Parliament resumed Thursday in its new hybrid format, with many MPs attending remotely. The first order of business, reaction to yesterday's throne speech. Jamie Pashagumscum has the details.
In Ottawa, the stakes are high. The minority Liberal government needs one party's support to avoid an election. But the Conservatives have said they will not support the speech from the throne, and the Bloc Québécois are threatening not to. Therefore, the Liberals' only hope rests with the NDP. NDP leader Jagmeet Singh said his party's support depends on two demands.
If you want New Democrat Party support, if you want my support, then you have to stop the proposal to cut help to Canadians who cannot get back to work and make sure you put in place paid sick leave for all Canadian workers. If you want something to support, that is something I will support right away.
Meanwhile, the Native Women's Association of Canada released a statement asking for, among other things, economic support for Indigenous women. In an email, NWAC's president, Lorraine Whitman, told APTN that they saw some promising statements, but as the government moves to take action, we want to see them take stronger steps to ensure Indigenous women are represented at the decision-making table. AFN National Chief Perry Bellegarde says he took heart that Canada is building on their 2019 commitments.
Some details that jumped out at me were two new pieces of legislation. One on the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and then policing as an essential service. So two new pieces of legislation. We did advocate for that.
Bellegarde said he will be looking for these commitments in the minister's mandate letters and in the upcoming budget. Jamie Pashagumscum, APTN National News, Ottawa.
Nunavut's sole member of parliament gave an impassioned response to the throne speech in the House of Commons on Wednesday. Mumilaaq Qaqqaq says the federal government failed Inuit before the COVID-19 pandemic, and they still are. The NDP MP says homes in Nunavut are full of mold, they are overcrowded, and children are being taken away from their families because their homes were deemed unfit. Qaqqaq says the lack of housing and basic human rights for Indigenous peoples results in death.
Inuit are dying and have been before this pandemic. I did not have expectations of this throne speech, Mr. Speaker, because since the day I was born, Inuit have heard promises of a good life, of positivity, of being able to contribute it to society in a healthy way, to have basic human rights, and we continue to have those promises broken to us. I will start to have faith in the federal government, Mr. Speaker, once I see Inuit have the opportunity to live a life filled with dignity and respect. I will start to have faith in this institution once I see Indigenous people have the right to self-determination.
And you can watch that full speech by visiting our social media, Twitter and Facebook. Wednesday's throne speech may have been like none other given the COVID-19 pandemic, but it may have sounded like a broken record when it came to Indigenous issues. Many of the provinces from the 2019 throne speech were reiterated. For more, we spoke with the Minister of Indigenous Services, Mark Miller. Minister Miller, this throne speech sounded pretty familiar. A plan to implement legislation on the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, an action plan to address the crisis on missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. So why should people be hopeful these issues will be addressed during this minority government?
Well, it's important to remember that we had a very important speech from the throne a year ago, and the commitments made towards Indigenous peoples in the chapter from from the throne are those that continue, and that was reiterated in this speech from the throne only a year later. What has been clear is that during the global pandemic that has touched Indigenous peoples and brought to light the inequities and the socioeconomic gaps that exist, and as part of my mandate to close, is there are some things we got to move more quickly on. And conscious of the fact that we're still trying to keep people alive and we don't know exactly where COVID will rear its ugly head, and conscious of the fact that, in fact, there are 100 active cases in Indigenous communities, and that has to remain our priority, we still can move proactively to address some of these issues that have been exacerbated by the pandemic. And I think immediately on issues of systemic racism, reforming the RCMP, ensuring that policing is treated as an essential service, where that concept of essential service is taken for granted in non-Indigenous communities and reformed in the right way is key. Moving quickly on the infrastructure gap that continues to exist and continues to create those inequities that put Indigenous communities behind the ball when the pandemic broke out and continue to be more vulnerable, although now there are more tools to combat COVID. It is still something that is very raw and still something that needs to be remedied in an expeditious fashion.
But these were issues that were being worked on prior to the pandemic, prior to the past throne speech a year ago.
Yes, absolutely. And, you know, what immediately comes to mind is Grassy Narrows and Wabaseemoong, two communities that have been suffering from the effects of mercury poisoning. And despite this pandemic, we've been able to engage respectfully with the community and agree to fund mercury treatment centers in those communities and build that infrastructure despite a global pandemic. A lot of that work remains to be done, and a lot of those priorities can be done simultaneously, but there is no denying that obviously things have slowed down as communities have shut down and focused on their pandemic plans and focused on keeping their people safe. But we need to be able to, as we see the course of this epidemic charting across in ways that we can't necessarily predict, we need to be able to move and go back to a more surgical approach in risk management and ensuring that we can get those resources into communities and ensure that we support them through this new normal by investing in resources, financial, medical, and otherwise, and ensuring that they have the resources to make the decisions that they need to make to keep their people safe and to keep closing that socioeconomic gap, which our indicators are showing are closing, but not at the rate that we would like to see.
One of the 4 priorities of the throne speech that was also in last year's throne speech includes walking the road of reconciliation. What does that mean? Because I think many people believe the federal government hasn't been walking that road.
Well, what we've become painfully aware of as a government is that the road to reconciliation is neither linear nor easy, and a lot of the promises that we made remain to be delivered on because there is decades of wrongdoing, and I think about the work that needs to be done, but done in the right way, done with engagement, done through listening, done through recognizing rights that have been inherent and haven't been crystallized in Canadian law. We see a painful example of that playing out on the eastern shores of Canada and Nova Scotia with treaty rights that have existed since the 1760s that have yet to be defined in law, and people's lives are being put at risk as a result. There are many iterations of that will continue to go on. But what I think I find heartening as a minister in this government is that the Prime Minister and the civil service are dedicated to moving forward in the face of billions of dollars of investment being put into communities with results that we can show tangible, but with the acknowledgement that much more work needs to be done. And that dedication by the government, by my government, is something that I'm very proud of, but we know that there is much more work to be done, and done in a way that respects Indigenous rights.
Minister, we'll have to leave it there. Indigenous Services Minister Mark Miller, thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
Well, we'd like to hear what you think about the throne speech or what you just heard there. Here's how you can continue that conversation. You can send your emails to news@aptn.ca or find us online at aptnnews.ca. We're also on YouTube at youtube.com/aptnnews. You can also follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram for the latest Indigenous news. Coming up, a special look at the media coverage of the so-called Oka crisis and how some are still working to change the bias that exists. Stay with us. Here's a look at Friday's weather forecast starting on the East Coast. 21 under the sun in Halifax, 16 for St. John's. Rain in Nain with a high of 7, 11 in Cartwright. 13 in Saguenay, 12 for Chibougamau. 22 with showers in Sault Ste. Marie and North Bay. Showers, then 19 for Thunder Bay, Sioux Lookout and Timmins. 7 with rain in Churchill, rain, and 20 for God's Lake. 24 and showers in Gimli and Winnipeg, 24 under the sun in Brandon. 22 in Regina, Saskatoon, Estevan, and Yorkton. 12 with rain in Uranium City, 16 in Buffalo Narrows. Welcome back. 30 years ago, the so-called Oka crisis ignited an international media firestorm. For years, community members would grapple with the sensationalism, or some might say racism, so prominent in the mainstream media coverage of 1990. Issues that persist today. Tonight, Lindsay Richardson brings us the story of how 4 members of the Mohawk Nation are each in their own way working to change that.
We're tired of that. We're taking a stand, and this is what they give us. I've done it for 30 years, every single anniversary. So the people who are interviewing me, they could just go back from the year after, 10 years later, and I'm saying the same thing. We've tried to talk to them, and our voice is falling on deaf ears. Our words fall on deaf ears. And that includes the media. It's kind of frustrating on my side that I have to keep doing this and reiterating, this is our land. It was never given up. This land is being stolen right from under us. They want people to get hurt over a golf course. The Native people are fed up.
According to Canada's history books, it was around this time 30 years ago the 78-day siege known as the Oka Crisis came to an end. But for the Mohawks at Kanesatake, the fight for land and title didn't end when the cameras turned off, or when the mainstream media stopped paying attention.
They show in how they present their stories that they actually have no understanding of the profound and deeply multi-generational conflict that exists here, and that it's really about the land.
In 2020, community members are resisting construction at a development site on unceded land. But without the media draw of the 1990 crisis, Ellen now resorts to her own means to get the message out.
Sagon, Wacha, Walalan, bonjour. My name is Kanesatake Ellen Gabriel, and I'm here at the illegal development site.
The videos often garner hundreds, sometimes thousands of hits.
Social media has been used quite powerfully by the youth, and I saw that live was getting a lot of attention, and people could tell their story with their own voices. I spend hours or time with the media to explain to them, and they show 3 seconds. I figured social media is the best place to have our voices really heard and understood by everybody who's interested in the truth. This is pavement. Perhaps that belongs to the municipality of Oka, but the ground underneath belongs to us. And that's it. It's very difficult. The media doesn't get it. We're still viewed as a very divided community. We're still viewed as being the radicals, and I'm still happy to be called a radical.
Believe it or not, I was called a radical a long time ago, so I didn't know I was insulted or not. And I looked up radical, and radical says returning to roots or returning to fundamentals. And so I don't have a problem with us being called radical, because that's what we are.
Kenneth Deere played media point person for just 3 days in 1990, but learned quickly what story reporters were interested in.
They tried to find weaknesses and try to distract the issue. Say, well, is it really about the land, or is it about cigarettes, or about something else? The media seemed to be focusing on guns and masked warriors and wearing camouflage. And that wasn't really the issue.
And this ain't a surrender either.
Once the siege ended, there was struggle to set the record straight.
I remember in the past, you would, if you put an op-ed in a paper and you asked to be paid for it, they'd say, well, you should just be grateful that it's being published.
Deer's not the only one critical of the media treatment of 1990. The book Seeing Red examines 400 years of Canadian newspaper coverage. Of Oka, it says, for the first time, a sustained counter-narrative emerged, one which engaged and challenged colonialism fully. But it was difficult to hear amidst the roar of colonial-style reportage. Not much Indigenous journalism existed at the time of the 1990 siege. 2 years later, that would change.
I had no money, but I had some friends and acquaintances and a couple of enemies, and we got together and we all agreed, came to a consensus that yes, let's have a newspaper.
In January 1992, the Eastern Door was born.
There was only like 1,500 domiciles here, but I was selling like 2,000 or 3,000 papers. And other people have told me that the Eastern Door helped heal the community in that time of recovery from the crisis.
Dr. Deer has made his mark in many areas, including education, the media, and the international politics.
Last year, Deer was recognized by the Quebec government for his contributions to journalism. In turn, he recognizes a new generation of Indigenous journalists.
There's a tremendous interest now in journalism that wasn't there before. It takes practice. Very few people are born journalists. You have to practice journalism.
Colonialism has taught us, to destroy ourselves. 1990, I was 14 years old, and I was just kind of coming into my own, and it was like it fast-forwarded my whatever I was, whatever my persona was, whatever I thought I'd be. It was like, boom, here we go. You're going to be this now. You have no choice.
Steve Bonspiel is now the editor-publisher of the Eastern Door. But the Indigenous journalism class he teaches at Concordia University is so popular, he says it filled to capacity minutes after opening for registration.
One of the main things I tell them is you're not going to be able to learn 500 years of colonialism that is on our shoulders, but you better damn well learn about that story that you're covering.
Besieged warriors have repeatedly taunted the military, this one tossing flares at two soldiers standing guard overnight.
As a teen, Bonspiel was marked by how his home community, Kanesatake, was depicted in the mainstream.
It was hard to get a fair story. I mean, I was pretty young, so to me, all coverage was biased. Because I could see, 6 o'clock news, I'd pick apart. Oh, they're using Indian again. Oh, they said, this, they use these words. They don't care because they're not catering to us as viewers. They don't even care that we're watching.
The soldiers showed restraint as individuals taunted them, swore at them, and then began jostling the troops.
Today, he's teaching a new crop, the Indigenous style guide of reporting as he sees it.
I think that the sickness that happens too in mainstream is you forget about our communities until there's something big that happens. APTN changed that.
It's been just over a year since the official birth of Nunavut.
10 years after the siege, the world's first ever Indigenous broadcaster, APTN, made its debut. Dan David, APTN's first news director, is from Kanesatake. We asked if the 1990 occupation at all influenced his leadership at the time.
Everything had everything to do with it. It's not just because you're hiring people who are brown and red and, other color under the rainbow. It's the fact that you've got people who are questioning not just outside, not just Canada or whatever province they happen to be reporting in, but they're questioning themselves. And I think that that's critical. Way back, like about 40 years, we understood that there had to be a change. There had to be a change in the newsrooms itself. We needed to have Indigenous voices. And that's really what I think the Oka crisis was all about, wanting to be heard, demanding to be heard and understood.
Making change in the media major leagues takes time, but in the 30 years since the standoff, the communities involved have mobilized. Kanesatake now has 2 weekly newspapers and a radio station operating on the territory. Bonspiel had plans to launch a paper in Kanesatake in 2020 until COVID hit.
This is RKR 101.7 FM, reviving Kanesatake Radio.
But even during quarantine, the community managed to get their radio station back on the air.
They need as many outlets, creatively, expressively, anything to get them out there to say, we are proud and you should support us, because we're not just about the crisis. We're a living, breathing, caring community that wants to move forward.
The Vian Commission final report backs this up. Although media is slowly improving their response, it found, quote, the problem lies in the persistence of certain ideological biases, which many believe were reinforced by the events at Oka in the early 1990s. The report itself might not offer the framework needed to force improvements to news coverage, but at least in some parts of the Mohawk Nation, the improvements have already come from within. Lindsay Richardson, APTN National News, Jojage, Montreal.
Great story. Well, still to come, Indigenous entrepreneurs launch a personal protective equipment business. Stick around. Here's a look at the rest of Friday's weather forecast, picking back up in northern Alberta. 17 for Fort McMurray, 16 in High Level. 22 under the sun in Medicine Hat, 19 and sunny for Edmonton. Showers on the west coast, 15 in Tofino, 16 in Victoria. 10 with rain in Dease Lake, 11 with showers for Prince George. 5 in Old Crow, snow, and +4 for Rock River. 11 in Yellowknife, 13 in Fort Liard. +1 in Sax Harbor, 6 with showers for Pawlatuck. 2 with snow in Repulse Bay, 7 with rain for Baker Lake. -4 with snow in Resolute, 2 below and snow in Arctic Bay. Welcome back. There's an outbreak of COVID-19 at a shelter for homeless people in Edmonton. The long-running Hope Mission had a positive case recently, and that's led to 7 confirmed cases, with 1 since recovered. Alberta Health Services told APTN in a statement that they are testing everyone who was exposed. Anyone found to be at risk has been transferred to an isolation facility at an undisclosed location. This outbreak marks the first incident of COVID-19 at an Edmonton shelter. A new Indigenous-owned and operated store recently opened in Winnipeg, and it's hoping to be a one-stop shop in helping stop the spread of COVID-19. Exchange PPE specializes in selling and educating customers about personal protective equipment, including face shields, hand sanitizer dispensers, and machines like this fogger that distribute disinfectant solution. The group formed in early spring to supply First Nation communities with the tools they need to keep members safe. After seeing a much greater need and greater market, they decided to open a storefront.
Very clear sense during our sale growth with First Nations that there's a huge education curve. So we need to give people an ability to somewhere to come and learn those things and ask those questions. We're getting educated every day, more and more of what's out there, for new technologies to effectively fight this. And our customers also are learning right along with us. So it's really a two-part thing.
And that is all the time we have for your APTN National News this Thursday. For more on these or any other story, visit our website, aptnnews.ca. We leave you tonight with some of the sights of the season changing from near Hollow Water First Nation in Treaty 5 territory. I'm Dennis Ward. Thanks for tuning in. Have a great night.